Okay, and so I'd like to introduce you guys all to Kate Little, one of my very good friends, who is an amazing sport, because just 2 days ago I asked her whether she would do this. So she had almost no time to prepare. And so thank you so much for being here, Kate, and being ready at like a moment's notice. And whenever you're ready, you can introduce yourself further and start.
All right, super. So, hi, I'm Kate Little. I train dressage and eventing horses just outside of San Jose in California. I have been a professional for 13, 14 years now. And I started teaching in an incredibly unscientific way. I pretty much decided that I knew how to ride a horse and I could teach other people how to ride horses. And basically set a sign in my front yard and gave lessons to people who stopped to see the sign. And I had this one little girl who came every week. And she eventually got to the point where she could canter, but only if I was running alongside the horse. And I thought to myself, well, that's about it. I don't know what else to teach anymore. There can't be anything else. That has to be the totality of horseback riding. And that's when my grandmother took me to the library and said, there's probably books on this. And then kind of started my love affair with reading and studying the literature on horses. And about 6 years ago, I got the first equitation science book that Andrew McLean and Paul McGreevy wrote, and it pretty much transformed the way that I train and teach, just in terms of giving so much clarity to the understanding of why and what we're doing on any given day. And so today in my talk, my hope would be that you guys have come away with, I see that some of you are familiar with Andrew McLean's work already, but my goal would be that you guys have a better framework for assessing the problems that you're experiencing with your horse, and maybe some new skills in being able to dissect problems into like the basics, the smallest pieces that are contributing to whatever challenges you have, whether it's as simple as, my leg yield left is smoother and easier than my leg yield right. Or, I asked for some problems and you guys submitted some super awesome problems, and we're going to go through them a little bit later and talk about different ways to kind of solve some of those challenges. And I saw a lot of, some bigger problems, like, general anxiety and spookiness. That's a huge barrier between between where we are now and where we want to be. And there is so much to this. There's so much amazing research and so much amazing writing. I wanted to show you guys. So this, oh, nope, that's not it. This is the my original equitation science book. You can see it's fairly well worn. I read this one quite a lot. And at one point, I lent it to one, gave it back to me like this, and I can't bring myself to take those notes away. So anyways, I just think it's just to say that there is so much more knowledge available than what we would ever be able to cover in an hour, 2 hours, 27 hours. There's just there's so much about the world of the looking at the lens of equitation science and equine learning theory. There's just a lot. So we will do what we can to get through some of what I consider to be the basics tonight. And just to tie it back a little bit to the lecture that Alexis gave last week, in the Mary Wanless world, or in the biomechanics world, we talk a little bit about different toolkits where we're training our horses. So we have a zero toolkit, which is where we're going to be firmly in today, which is the learning theory and the groundwork and the basic obedience to aids, etc. And then we have our first toolkit, which is what Alexis was talking about last week, which is sort of our stability, our ability to influence the horse's shape and movement underneath us. And then we have second toolkit, which is using patterns to change the way that the horse goes, like leg yield to lengthening, or 10-meter circle to half pass, or what have you. But so we're not going to be dealing with first or second toolkit too much today. We're going to mostly be talking about very much first toolkit stuff. And I just have to flip my notes around, sorry. Okay, so we're going to start by defining a few terms. One of the most important things to consider in our scientific view of horses is that anthropomorphism is huge and runs rampant in the way we talk about horses, and we have to be very, very, very careful when we anthropomorphize our horses. So anthropomorphism, of course, is assigning human attributes or decision-making processes to an animal. And you can see this all the time, like, oh, Fluffykins is just being a jerk today. Well, that's not helpful in our training, because it makes it much more likely that we just blame the horse for their misbehavior rather than take responsibility for our ability to ride and train the horse. So we might assess some anthropomorphism later, but I just wanted to start with that because it can be so detrimental to a horse's well-being, because we're so much more likely to come in on too high a scale of pressure too quickly for a horse that we have assigned or ascribed negative motivations. So if we think that our horse is out to get me, or he wants to embarrass me, or he just doesn't want to do it, or whatever, we are much more likely to be unintentionally unethical in our handling of those situations due to the likelihood of coming in a little too high on the pressure scale. So then the next term would be habituation. And habituation, I'm going to try to burn through the boring stuff and show you a bunch of pictures of things later. So habituation is, we want the horse to, basically habituation is when a horse will receive a stimulus of some sort and not respond to it. Examples of habituation include when we put the saddle and a girth on the horse. We want the horse to just ignore the girth. The girth needs to be meaningless. It needs to be neutral. It needs to have no emotional impact on a positive or a negative way. Carrying a bridle, carrying the weight of the rider, habituate. Cars driving past your arena, the horse needs to habituate to that, and they need to be non-reactive to that. Of course, we'll talk more about the cars thing later, because that relates to spookiness in horses. And so then the next thing the term that I want to talk about is the idea of a horse having a reinforcement history for any behavior. And so I guess by saying I'm going to define it now, it's a little bit misleading. I just want to mention it so that it's a term that you guys we're going to tie it all into all the other stuff that I'm going to go through here today. But the reinforcement history for things is really, really huge. And I think we have a tendency not to deepen the basics, the reinforcement history for those things enough. And I'll talk more about that. And then we have the different reinforcers. So we have positive reinforcement, which would be like a scratch in front of the withers, which Andrew McLean actually did the study that shows that you can drop a horse's heart rate up to 10 beats a minute by scratching them just in front of their withers, right where a horse would groom one another, which I think is super cool. Or like a cookie, positive reinforcement has, we see it a lot with clicker training in dogs, or clicker training in horses too. I do quite a bit of, and we'll talk a little bit about that too. Negative reinforcement sounds kind of bad, but it's not. Most people do 95 of their training with their horses through negative reinforcement, where a negative stimulus ranging from mildly aversive through highly aversive is applied. And when the horse responds in the way you want them to, you take that away. So we're super familiar with this in your very first walk trot lessons when you were, you're riding the nappy lazy lesson pony and your instructor told you that you first need to whisper, where you give a little squeeze of your calves and then you ask with the cluck and then you tell them and you kick, right? And then of course you stop kicking when they trot on. So that's the negative reinforcement. And then I'm going to upset some of my more scientific friends because I'm just going to refer to punishment in one lump sum here. I'm going to refer to punishment as anything negative that we introduce to the horse after they've done something that we don't like. I know most of us are probably dressage riders, but jumping is a very clear example. A horse, you're cantering along, you're cantering up to a jump, the horse sees the jump, they decide they don't want to, for whatever reason, they decide to quit and they stop, and then you spank them with the stick. That would be an example of punishment. Or a horse goes to bite you, you smack them, punishment. So those are kind of we're going to start with that language. And I'm going to share a quote from the equitation science book. Dressage horses are ridden on a contact, which means that the horse habituates to a low level of rein, leg, and seat pressure. Above those low levels of pressure, the horse should react, and this presents a discrimination difficulty to the horse, and subsequently often results in dull horses that have habituated to one or more of the aids. Which isn't great. We obviously don't want a horse that doesn't understand what the bridle means, or what the leg aids mean. We obviously need the horses to, of course, respond to anything above that low level of pressure that they need to. I'm sorry, I've given myself too many things here. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to talk about here is how do I make it big? There we go. This is Andrew McLean's shaping scale. And we're all, of course, familiar with the dressage training scale: rhythm, relaxation, contact, impulsion, straightness, collection. And this is not the same, although it has some of the same words. So it's an interesting way to think about any individual behavior, ranging from all the way from the basic attempt. Of course, below what you're seeing here on your screen, below this shaping scale, there is no response, which might be the goal. If you're habituating a horse to something, they might have a reaction that isn't the correct response. But anyhow, so the basic attempt, the horse offers a basically correct response. It's usually just one step, and from a light aid. And you'll see this a lot in Andrew McLean's work, and is super critical to the ethology and well-being of the horse, that you could say that a horse has a basic attempt to leading. Like I have this lesson horse, his name is Elrond, he's fantastic, but he's also super habituated to pretty much all of the go aids. And so sometimes a kid will be leading him in from his pasture and basically dragging them with all their tiny might. And so you might look at that and say well, he's basically offering a basic attempt, right? He's moving forward from an aid, one creeping step at a time. But this isn't totally accurate. It's because it's not from a light aid. And so that's just very important to think about when you're assessing problems, because you can think, yeah, I can make my horse move off my inside leg, but how much pressure does it take? Have you reduced that to the lowest amount of pressure that's possible to still elicit the correct response? Now, remember that there's a low level of pressure in our dressage horses that they need to be habituated to, and they need to be able to discriminate above that. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. But, and then next we have obedience, where all the time you can at least get one stride from a very light aid. And then we have rhythm, where the horse will maintain their rhythm. So we're going to use my lesson pony and the small child example. Let's say that this kid is retraining my lesson horse. Thank you so much. And now she can provide a little forward pull on Elrond's halter, and he will take, at the walk, all 4 of his legs at the least will move an additional step. At rhythm, he would just keep walking. And then we get into that concept of maintenance aids with that, which is where you initiate something and then the horse should keep doing it. We see this a lot in the natural horsemanship stuff. Like Clinton Anderson has an exercise he calls cruising. And basically his whole joke is that, like, if you put a horse in trot, they had better trot until you like fall off, and not canter, not walk, but they should just keep going forever until you tell them to do something else. And so, totally lost where I was going with that. Anyhow, that's rhythm. And then we develop straightness out of that, where the horse would maintain their directional line and the straightness. So if I'm riding my horse around the arena and I ask a horse to trot down the long side, the horse would pretty much stay straight until they stay on their line of travel until they couldn't, because there's a fence there. And then when we reach the level of contact, the horse would be maintaining a consistent outline. And the degree of outline would sort of change depending on how schooled your horse is. So it could just be that the horse has a very natural outline. It could be your pre-St. George outline. But that they're not changing the tempo, right? Because if they're changing the tempo without the aid to do so, then all of a sudden we have to drop back down to the obedience level of, sort of shaping, scaling our analysis, because the horse may have their head in the same position the whole time, but if they are disobedient to the steadiness, not disobedient, that's a little anthropomorphic, but so they need to have all prior criteria. And then we have proof, where the horse is under so all of the prior criteria apply anywhere you go when a horse is fully proofed on any behavior. So we would be able to go to any show, any outback field, any gymkhana, and have the horse go in a straight line, in the same contact, from a light aid, anytime, anywhere, pretty much. And then that will bring us to, if we were to break all horse behaviors down, about as small as we can get them, in the groundwork that we're referring to is, and Andrew McLean talks a fair bit about this in his books, the groundwork that we're going to do here, the in-hand work, is as it directly relates to a ridden horse. And there are pretty much only 4 things that we can ask for from our horses on the ground in hand. We can ask them to lift their head up and down. Here I am with my horse Duende. We're going to see him a little bit more later. I'm asking him to put his head down. I'm asking him to lift his head up. So I can ask him to lift his head up, and I can ask him to put his head down. You can go with a horse, which in our example with Elrond earlier, it's not very good with his small child, but they can go. Now, go isn't just as simple as walking, right? Go has also in itself, it has lengthen the step, it has quicken the step, and it has an upward transition. And then we, of course, the inverse of that is we have stop. And stop can also be broken down into shorten the step, slow the step, do a downward transition, park, which is super critical for our in-hand work. And parking is where we, oh God, I have to have an image of a horse parked somewhere. Let me see if I can find it. We took a whole bunch of photos of me doing groundwork yesterday for this. So Duende's going on the lunge line. He's stretching. No, he's not going to park there. Anyways, there, parked and yawning. Perfect. And then also reining back is a subset of stop. And then we have yield, which is where we can cross their hind legs. And you might be surprised to see that turning their shoulders isn't necessarily a part of our in-hand work. And I failed to look up the portion of the book in which he describes that, but for the most part in the McLean work, we don't focus on doing shoulder turns in hand. It's mostly yielding the hind legs and going and stepping and all of that. Although in a lot of the groundwork that I do these days, I do focus a lot on doing more shoulder turns. So when we get into problems later, one of the things that we're going to talk about is I'm first going to describe how, like, by the textbook, we would solve, or by, this very, very large textbook, how we would solve the problems that you guys have had. And then I'll go a little bit into what I would do if this horse were to show up at my barn, because it's not always totally textbook, because Andrew McLean a little bit writes as if we are like disconnected legs and hands, and kind of forgets that we have a torso connecting the legs and hands. So that's our in hand. There's really only 4 things that we can ask for from our horse. We can ask them to go, we ask them to stop, we ask them to pick their head up and down, and we ask them to yield their hind legs. Under saddle, we have go again, which has all the same subsets of quickening, lengthening, up transitions. And we have stop, same thing applies. And now we have turn the shoulders, and we can turn the shoulders with a direct leading rein or an indirect rein. And we have leg yield, which is yield on the ground. And then we have jumping, which I don't know that it necessarily is totally separate. I think you could probably boil jumping down to the going and turning aids, because if you tell a horse to go and they are 100% obedient to those aids, most horses don't like to smack solid obstacles or even the poles. So they figure out how to get out of there. So that's kind of my very, very quick run through of some of the very broad, basic, basics. And I know I've covered a lot of ground in not a lot of time. So with that said, do we want me to go deeper into anything, or should I move forward? I can re-explain, I can answer any questions. I want to make sure that I'm not just leaving people behind as I move through all of this. There's not really. Sorry, so Jen J asks, what's the difference between halt and park? In hand, there shouldn't be a sizable difference. I will talk a little bit about so when we do groundwork, a lot of times we want the horse to stop when we stop our feet and then start walking when we move our feet. Andrew McLean argues that that is not actually how we should do it for the horses, because of all the times that we put a horse somewhere and then we walk away, our feet leave, and the horse shouldn't leave, right? So let's put our horses in the cross ties and then we leave to go get brushes or tack or this or whatever. If the horse only follows our feet, then they aren't going to understand. Eventually, I mean, horses are unbelievably context specific. It will only take walking forward and hitting the cross ties, for some horses, a couple of times, others hundreds, to learn that when they're in this one spot, they end up having to stay. And there's the visual stimulus of the cross ties coming in that can help them differentiate whether or not they're allowed to walk on. But if we were to have our horse, purely McGreevy and McLean trained, we would apply backward pressure on the halter or the reins to ask for the halt, and then we could leave, and the horse's feet should never move. And then if we come back to the horse, we ask the horse to take a step forward, and we want the horse to take the first step before we move our legs, so that they are responding to the aid and not just following your body. Because our walking with them is the maintenance aid. I have noticed that the ability to have the horse take the first step off that forward pressure on the halter or bridle improves a horse's ability to lunge quite a bit. And I have some notes on that. We got a question about lunging that we can go over later. But does that answer your question, Jen? That there's not too much of a difference between halt and park? Perfect. Okay. As I said, I unfortunately failed to find that section in the book where he describes it. He does talk a little bit about if the horse tries to trample you too much, how to use negative reinforcement to sort of turn the horse, but it's not an individual thing that he thinks you should spend a whole ton of time training. He's a lot more focus in hand on turning the hindquarters and having the horse go forward and stop, etc. Cool. Do we have any other questions at this time? All right, super. So one thing that I did want to share that I discovered in my research of all of this, in 2007, a woman named Lindsay Wood, she works for the Karen Pryor Institute, did this study on 2 groups of naive dogs to find out if there was any difference between using okay, well, I gotta back up. I skipped too many steps. So when we're doing positive reinforcement or clicker training, a lot of times we have a bridge signal to use the bridge to mark the moment where the horse does what we want. And this allows us to bridge the moment that they do what we want to the moment we can give them food. So the clicker itself is not a positive experience to the horse. In fact, many of them have a fear response to the sound of the clicker. Or when we say good to a horse, we think that means something to them, but it's really a very neutral, unless we have used good boy, good girl, or whatever as a bridge to giving them a scratch in that area just in front of their withers. And if every time we say good and we scratch them, then eventually good itself becomes positively charged. And so we use bridge signals a lot for horses, well, and for dogs too, but for horses, if you're going to use a structured positive reinforcement methodology, if you're in hand work or if you're ridden work, horses are just too long to be able to time stuffing cookies in their face at the right moment. And so, so we use this bridge signal. And most often it's a clicker, but a lot of people will use the word yes. So back to the study, Lindsay Wood did this study, and any difference between using a verbal bridge signal, the word yes, and a clicker. Both groups were taught the same behavior of bumping a target with their nose, only the bridge signal was different, so it was the same trainer. The dogs in the clicker group completed their training faster. They averaged 36 minutes to completion than the dogs in the verbal bridge group, which took on average 59 minutes. And the study goes on to explain that this can probably be described by the inherent instability in our voice. We can very easily change the tonality of our voice. So it's ever so slightly different. And the clicker makes the exact same noise every time. The clicker is also a new and neutral sound. We don't ever accidentally make the sound of a clicker. It just doesn't happen. So it being both novel and unvariable allows for the horse to learn, or sorry, in this case, the dog to learn more quickly. But I do want to just make another callback to Alexis's biomechanics talk, in that the more stable we can get as riders, the more still we can be, the more consistent we can be with our timing, the more like that clicker we can be. And this describes a huge portion of why, you know, your trainer can get on the horse and get something amazing to happen. And you're like, this is hopeless for me. It's really just in the clarity and timing of the aids. And I haven't yet talked much about how unbelievably critical timing is to training the horse. And I think it's not something that is talked enough about or broken. What happened there? Are we back?
Internet problem. You are back.
Oh, okay. All right. I'm sorry about that, guys. I don't know what happened there. Okay, that totally threw me off. Okay, so this is a network, a map of things that all contribute to a horse's success in training. The horses, you know, our ability to know very clearly what we're looking for, you know, the horse's inherent personality, their conformation, etc. I mean, you can see it, but it's when we're assessing where we are in our progress, whether our goals are to, you know, compete at, you know, first level or to compete at Prix St. George, you know, there's the barrier between where we are and where we want to be often lies somewhere in this this map of the different things that can cause can prevent us from having success with the horse's training. Okay, so we talked about being still in our timing. We're talking about breaking the timing down. Okay, the loss of internet really totally lost my train of thought there. I can share this graphic, yes. I'll send it to Megan and I'll have her send it along with the link for the recording. It is kind of funny. Someone in the chat says that it was bad timing, and I do think it cut out while I was talking about timing. So I think that's fantastic. Oh, okay. So Jen says that we didn't get the section about training. Oh, bummer. So I was really just pontificating about how we can get so much better at our timing with a very clear understanding of what exactly it is that we're looking for in the horse. So if we're working on yield in the hind legs, so we want the hind legs to cross, horses are really good at kind of shimmying sideways where the hind legs don't actually cross. So, you know, let's say the right hind leg isn't really crossing the midline, it's just stepping close to the left hind leg, and then the left hind leg takes this big, huge step away. And So if we were to, were to keep pressing on the horse with our, with our aids, if we're using a whip, like just, we're tapping on their haunches, asking them to step over. Let's say that the horse is not taking the correct step. They're not crossing under with that inside hind leg. But they have just sort of shot away from us incorrectly. For better, for worse, the horse doesn't discriminate that they did anything wrong there. In that moment, the horse has gotten the release from pressure, and the horse has learned that if they just skivvy away from you quickly enough, that a release could come. So, many trainers, or if we're kind of not focused on it, we might not even realize that the horse just got a +1 reward for doing it the way we don't want them to. And in order to counter that, we're now going to have to do the correct version and provide reinforcement, deepening our reinforcement history 4 or 5 times correctly, because whatever's written first in the horse's mind is written most deeply. So, and a horse might not, it's a little anthropomorphic to say, but they might not hold on to that first mistake all that strongly. And that is, I think, a little bit up to the personality of the horse. Some horses are more on a thinking type and less a reactive type, more likely to choose to think things through than to react very quickly with their legs. But I know at least some of us here have thoroughbreds, and the thoroughbreds really like to go quickly for things. So, I wanted to show you guys this this poster that Andrew McLean puts out. It's horrible to show all on one screen. Sorry. But that when we are training our horses, there are sort of 10 laws that they, not laws, but sort of, principles that we want to attend to. Of course, the regard for horse and human safety. Sometimes we put ourselves in dangerous situations by hurrying the training along a little faster than we realize. This concept does not come from Andrew McLean's work, but instead Shauna Karish's work. She's it's where I was introduced to it anyhow. The idea of trigger stacking, or a horse being over threshold. And Shauna Karish tells this way. So if your phone were to ring right now while you're listening to this talk, it wouldn't bother you that much. You would just note, oh, it's my phone ringing. But let's say it's 11:30 at night and you're watching a scary movie and all the lights are out and you're pretty sure the main character is about to die and your phone rings. It totally freaks you out. And so at that point you had a few too many triggers. And for a horse that maybe hasn't completely habituated to a low level of pressure in the reins, even until they have really, really habituated to that low level of contact, that in and of itself can be a trigger. Or if it's a very young horse with very few rides, your weight, although the horse might be tolerating it, it might not yet be completely neutral to them. So let's say, you're holding their face, which is unacceptable to them, and you're sitting on them, which is very strange. And then something that wouldn't bother them at all if you weren't sitting on them, like a bunny rabbit jumps out near the round pen and goes running across the parking lot. Your horse might totally blow their lid because they've stacked one too many triggers. And so it can be very easy to neglect to notice when we've stacked too many triggers and we've gotten the horse too close to threshold. And a big part of the training is that the horse learns that anytime they experience discomfort, they can escape it. And if the horse does not know very firmly that pain is escapable, we develop all sorts of negative welfare, or worst case scenario, learned helplessness, or the horse sort of just is convinced that there's no hope. So why try learning? And then, regard for the nature of horses. Again, when we talked earlier about anthropomorphism, that's an example of not being very true to the nature of horses. If we ascribe human motivations to the horse, then that's not fair to the horse. Regard for, mental and sensory abilities, emotional states, you guys can see that. And we've been talking about operant and classical conditioning, although not with that language, as we've gone through some of this stuff. Regard for self-carriage, of course, is when I was talking about that it's super critical that we develop everything to the lightest aid possible. That tiny child we keep going back to, dragging my poor lesson horse through the field, is not necessarily, hasn't gone back to the self-carriage point. Elrond is clearly not carrying himself as that child is dragging him in from the field. But looking at this list, is there anything that you guys want me to go into any more detail on? And just feel free to ask it in the chat. I've got it up. Okay. So we have one no, and then yes. So someone asked me to share this as well. I can definitely get this shared as well. This one's on their website. So, but that's very, very easy to share. Okay. So this is a junction for us in our conversation here tonight. We can go deeper into the theory, and we can explore in more detail how the basic in-hand exercises what they would look like as we go through Andrew McLean's shaping scale. We can do the under saddle exercises, how they would look like in different places in the shaping scale. We can go deep into some of the challenges and problems that you guys sent to us. There were so many awesome ones, and could probably be like a whole separate talk. We got a bunch of people talked about spooking as a problem with their horses, and I'd love to get into that. But if so, I just want to leave it up to you guys. Do we want to just move forward with those challenges and kind of, or do we want to, is there anybody who would like to do either way? I'm seeing one vote for challenges. Oh, I have a question that says, how can you differentiate between doesn't want to and doesn't understand? So I would say that almost always there's two things. Perhaps there's something that makes it so there isn't sufficient motivation to do whatever you're asking for. Let's say flying lead change, just because I was schooling that with one of my client horses earlier today. If you ask for the change and you're reasonably sure the horse has it, they understand the aid because they've done it before, or they did it yesterday, or what have you, and it doesn't happen. So why is that? Is that because they are just like being difficult jerks? Is it that I didn't get out of their way? Is it that I kept did I prevent the horse from doing it underneath me? Did I make it difficult enough with my balance that the horse couldn't? And that I wasn't wearing spurs or carrying a whip at the time, so I had very little motivation. Now, I could make it incredibly difficult for the horse, but also add enough aversive stimulus that the horse goes anyways. Yes, absolutely. So then then lameness and pain, Jane says, to consider as well. So that is a huge thing that can stand in the way for a horse. Like horses, for example, like with SI problems, leg yielding is really challenging, super hard. just because of the torque through their low back like that. You could say that, you know, you could get more painful than their back. You totally could. I don't recommend it, but you could. And then the horse could leg yield just fine because your ability to apply an aversive stimulus is greater than whatever pain they're experiencing. Well, and then Jane says, then the horse bucks. Well, maybe, but it depends on the horse's personality. So I tend to almost always in my training go to the horse doesn't understand. I find it makes me a much better trainer. It makes me stop and be more thoughtful. If I was convinced that the horse understood and just isn't doing it because they don't want to, if I find myself thinking those things, I find it very useful to just stop and think, okay, what have I missed? Because there's almost always something I've missed. You know, like I was saying with the example, we're talking about going through our shaping scale, you know, and we're trotting around and the horse is, you know, pretty much on the bit, but the tempo keeps changing underneath me. I probably didn't shape this whole trotting in a straight line thing very well. And so in the shaping scale, so I guess that's a very long-winded to say, I try not to ascribe doesn't want to the horse, because I find that my training gets very muddied and not super, super clear. And it makes it difficult to be super clear to the horse if I think, well, the horse just doesn't want to. So why bother with, you know, like I have to really get them through it. And then I had someone say it would be interesting to know how you'd identify when you're close to the horse's limit. So that's a fantastic question, and is quite possibly a whole other talk. The horse's body language, their tonal quality, so sort of the tension of their muscles, the fluidity of response. So this is something that Andrew McLean talks a lot about when you are, when a horse isn't proved in their behavior yet, and we're going to use leading again because it's super simple to make examples for. Okay, I'm leading my horse, and my horse in like your ideal circumstance, like in his training arena, like he knows his buddies are right over there. He's been fed, you know, it's a totally ideal training circumstance. And we can lead off of super light pressure, and the horse walks right with me, totally in rhythm. They don't deviate and wander all over and try to, you know, whatever. They're totally straight. Head is long and relaxed, totally horizontal balance. You know, it's just perfect. Let's say the horse is basically a perfect leader in their training environment at home. And then I have taken my horse to a show, and the horse has decided that 2 trailers over, there's a horse kicking or pawing, and it's very disturbing. And all of a sudden I put my forward leading aid on the horse, and it's kind of sticky. It's like the horse is trying to split their attention and can't. That's going to be for a horse that I'm almost certain or very, very confident in their training. When the training suddenly seems to disappear, that's going to be like right away a signal to me that we're pretty close to threshold. But as far as reading their body language and noticing their tonal quality and all that gets into, I think, probably a little bit beyond just the learning theory. But that's my simple answer for one of the ways that I would try to identify when I'm close to a horse's threshold, their thinking threshold, so to speak. Okay, super. So Megan, if you could come back on and talk to us, or give me the first of the challenges that we had submitted to us.
Sure. So there's a few. So we had, it was interesting. We had a bunch of different categories. So I think what I'm going to do is give you each of these categories and just kind of go through a couple of like examples. Let's see. let's start with bucking. So we had 3 people submit bucking. Specifically, two of the 3 said that it happens in an upward transition or when asked to go forward. And then the third was just that it comes and goes, horses bucking. So.
Okay, conflict behavior. Conflict behavior is almost always the result of confusion. That there is, there's a good buck, pretty decent. This horse is an Andalusian and not, there we go. That's, I think, his best buck. And so rearing is definitely his go-to. Bucking isn't really his primary conflict behavior. So anyhow, so conflict behaviors arise as out of confusion primarily. And so when we have a horse that bucks in an upward transition, I would, in the Andrew McLean way, go back to, I would stop everything, we'd halt, and I would school the halt to walk transitions until I had my horse pretty well, probably all the way through rhythm and straightness, off of the lightest possible leg aid. So Andrew McLean talks about differentiating a lengthening leg aid is half of a stride, and a upward transition is 1.5 strides that you would close your lower leg, primarily your upper calf, because your heels are for sideways driving aids. So there's a whole bunch of differentiation for you. And so you'd make the halt to walk, the first upward transition, just like super reliable. And then you would do the next one. You'd make the walk to trot, super reliable off the lightest possible aid, and not worrying too much about the contact, keeping in mind that that's a little further down the shaping scale. But that to say that you don't necessarily want to do all of this training on a totally loose rein, just check, just whatever, because the horse does have to habituate to that low level of contact. When I say don't worry too much about the contact, what I really mean is don't be fussing about the shape of the horse, the posture of the horse in those initial retraining upward transitions, because that is incredibly difficult for the horse to differentiate. When you apply a rein aid to say, put your head down, it is very difficult for the horse to differentiate between that rein aid and the rein aid that means turn, and the rein aid that means stop, and the rein aid that means slow down, or what have you. And so in the scope of the McLean work, we shape on the bit as a criteria of downward transitions and turning, which I can get more into. Feel free to let me know if that sounds interesting to anybody. So you want to make the going aids just really super solid. And it takes a lot longer to deeply write that pattern of behavior until it's nearly an autonomic response than I think we give it credit for, as we are, it's very easy to be like, all right, we've gotten a couple good ones. Great. Now we move on. One of the things that I have absolutely incorporated from this work is the concept of working towards 3 improved responses in a row and taking a minimum of 2 minutes a break. And then you do another set of 3 improved responses in a row. Now, that first time you go to get the 3 improved responses in a row, it might be 8 to 12 efforts, transitions, until you get 3 improved responses in a row off of a light aid. And again, if you're going back to just that very light aid, there's a good chance that you might fall all the way back to basic attempt, and you'll really only get 1 good step at a time. Now, that means that you can't necessarily hurry the horse through to straight to rhythm. If the horse truly doesn't understand the light aid and you're going for a total retraining, in this way, to be very certain that you have the building blocks in a way that will eradicate that conflict behavior, you would train that basic attempt pretty thoroughly until the horse starts to offer that obedience or all the way through to rhythm more naturally. So you do 3 sets of 3. You would do 2 words. And so the first time that you do that set of 3, it might take you 8 to 12 attempts in order to get 3 improved responses in a row. The second time, usually 5 to 8. And then that third time, it might be 1 to 3 mistakes before you get the three in a row. That's certainly not scientific. It's just kind of what I found. And it is backed up by what Andrew McLean says in the academic horse training book. And so we've done all this laborious work of retraining our walk to trot transition. We've just made it so that we can just hold our upper calf against the horse for a step and a half, and they just trot off. Obviously they're halting, so it's really a beat and a half if they're halted, and they just walk on, and it's totally wonderful, and they walk all over the place, and they maintain their rhythm and walk and all that. And we've done that for the walk to the trot. Fantastic. And then we go from the trot to the canter, and all of a sudden that buck comes back. What now? We've done all this work. What does this mean? So it can be totally different from horse to horse to horse. Unfortunately, if a horse has a well-established bucking habit, there's a very good chance that they have just associated saddle and rider and trot to canter means that I buck. If a horse has really done it long enough to establish that reinforcement history, unfortunately, or maybe it's one arena, right? Like I have this one horse in training a year and a half ago that just really decided that there was, and for some reason, I just had accidentally reinforced it enough. There was one area of the arena that if I set a jump, I could guarantee you that horse would buck after that jump. And it took me a long time to notice that he had established that corner and that jump as the bucking jump. Unfortunately, long enough that he had pretty deeply ingrained that, and it took a fair bit of work to get through that. In that example, we worked through it by I just made it very, very difficult for him to buck. So if I were to jump there, I would try to halt within 3 strides after the jump. It's very difficult to buck well when you're halting, if you're obedient to the halting aids, etc. Anyway, back to our original problem. There's a chance that and maybe you're a little nervous in the trot to canter transition. I'm not saying you in particular, I'm saying any horse that goes from trot to canter and bucks, and you can kind of snatch at the reins. So telling the horse to stop and to go at the same time is in direct conflict of the training, and that is absolutely a great way to get a conflict behavior. That's why you see that's why most rearing starts, is because you've put a block on the front and then you've told the horse to go forward, and they're like, there's nowhere to go except up. So all right, does that answer that one a little bit in the McLean way?
That seems good.
All right, super.
Yeah. Do you want another subject, or do you want to keep going on bucking?
Do we have another version of, sorry, there's a question now about same concept in hand. Are we experiencing bucking in hand? Oh, in the photo. So this horse is 5, and I'll show you here if we're gonna describe the photo here. This one mostly was upset about being told to yield his shoulder. And as a result of me continuing to apply steady pressure, you can see the flag there. I was tapping him on that shoulder until it moved away from me the way I wanted it to. He ended up going blasting off and bucking as part of that conflict behavior. If I were to correct that in the Andrew McLean way, I would have had him trot within 3 strides and asked him to canter on. I didn't. In this circumstance, I let him keep cantering until the canter settled, and then I asked him to halt, and we stood in park for a little bit. But that's just largely because that's just how I did it. It wasn't totally Andrew McLean perfect at that time. But we do talk a lot in the academic horsemanship about deleting behaviors is the verbiage that they use. So if the horse makes a mistake of bucking on the lunge line, you want to basically delete the behavior by halting, or by downward transitioning within 3 strides and reinitiating that transition. So if my horse Duende here slid into canter and then went leaping about like a porpoise, I have 3 strides to get him to trot again. And that's why in the McLean work, we don't do a lot of lunging until our stop and go aids are super well installed, because it's just so easy for the criteria to fall apart on the lunge line. Good lunging really is an art. And so it's just so easy. So like if we ask for a downward transition from trot to walk, we want that to happen within 3 steps. If we ask for, a downward transition from canter to trot, we want that to happen within 3 strides. And it's just so easy to be unclear enough to the horse that we enable degradation of our own stimulus control. So there's that.
Cool. Yeah. Okay, let me see what we've got here. Let's switch gears and talk just about general tension. I've got a bunch that are just saying that either the horse gets tense when there's something kind of out in the world, not necessarily spooking at it, but that's one of our questions. Someone else, or a couple of people, have just general high anxiety horses, and they may start spinning or kind of whip around, throwing their head, that kind of thing. Where and there's one person who says that their horse starts quite nice, but then the horse kind of partway through the ride is like, nope, not anymore, and gets very tense and starts misbehaving. So maybe some generalized tension.
Yeah, so that's a great segue, because we had just mentioned stimulus control. So the horse can respond to you or to things in the environment, and they are under the stimulus control of, so you see this all the time. You're leading your horse around, it's just been a heavy rain, and there's a puddle that you are walking near, and the horse kind of skirts around the puddle, and then you have to jump out of the way so you don't get trampled by your beastie. In that moment, the horse is not under your stimulus control anymore. In that moment, the horse is absolutely under the environment stimulus control and is far more concerned about the puddle than about maintaining the straightness of their leading. And so a horse gets to be anxious for a lot of different reasons. Since we're talking so much about the equitation science framework, we'll go through the equitation science framework for that first, and then we'll talk a little bit about some of the ways that I would work through it these days. Okay, so we can always check our basic in-hand responses before we go on to do anything else. So if we are having some general anxiety at anything, it can be at home, it can be at a show, it can be, wherever in the field, I don't know. We want to check, can we go from a light aid? Can we stop from a light aid? Can we lift our head up and put our head down, all from light aids? And can we yield from a light aid? And if we cannot, we would do 3 sets of 3 and basically treat the horse as if, okay, great, I have just learned just now that moving through my shaping scale, I thought that I had absolutely proofed this in-hand behavior. Let's say go and stop. I thought that my horse would go and stop with contact and straighten and proof all the way anywhere. You know, I felt like I could lead them through a carnival and they would be fine. Well, clearly the horse is showing to you that at this point they need some refreshing on some of those in-hand behaviors to get them as light as possible in order to bring the horse back under your stimulus control. And so that would definitely be the McLean way to work through that, the equitation science framework. As far as what I've been doing with horses, the McLean, the equitation science, they doesn't talk a lot about a horse's emotional state. It does a little bit, but one of the things when we're training anything, when we're training, again, we'll go back to go in hand because it's just so easy. When we're leading our horse, we can shape the behavior to, you know, I want my horse to walk with their head horizontal level with their withers or whatever. And I can shape that to the point that I can reinforce it to the point where the horse pretty much always walks with their head in a fairly level with their withers. And horses aren't super great at differentiating body posture from emotional state. So that can be helpful. But one of the things that I've been working a lot with a lot of my horses on lately is identifying moments of identifying relaxation and trying to deepen the reinforcement history for behaviors executed in relaxation or towards relaxation. And this is, you know, starting to notice when their muscles are softening or the aids are going through their body a little bit more softly, and trying to make those things super positive experiences. And so the more positively charged I can make anything, the more likely it is that the horse will repeat it in totality in the same way. I use this example a lot with my eventing kids, but hopefully you dressage ladies can bear with me here. When you see a Grand Prix rider, a Grand Prix show jumper, let's say, and you see a lot of those horses who will come down to the fence and the rider kind of sits back a little bit and softens the rein and the horse just starts flinging their head like crazy. And then the horse jumps beautifully and they land and the horse is back on the bit. You know, that's not a conflict behavior. That's just the rider has let go of the horse's head every time they've approached a fence. And it's just so happened to arrive with head flinging at the same time enough that it gets to the point where the horse just thinks like, okay, in order to jump the big jumps, I do it with my head flinging everywhere. And so horses, you know, they don't know what we want, right? They don't have any idea what it is that we want, but whatever is reinforced will be repeated. And so the more I can reinforce anything with a relaxation pattern, the more likely it is that they'll offer that. And so you see a lot of different ways of inducing a relaxation pattern. One of my friends and mentors has a really fascinating use of endo tapping to introduce a relaxation pattern. So basically like tapping the horse, and you tap the horse until they start to relax. It's more complicated than that, but we'll just say, you know, we tap the horse until they relax and then you quit tapping them. So you sort of irritate them until they relax, which sounds counterintuitive. And so she practices that with her horses all the time, that she just can tap them right near their withers until they'll adopt a more relaxed posture and take a deep breath. And then she releases, she quits tapping them. And so that is so deeply reinforced that that's a behavior that the horse can execute almost anywhere. So when I'm looking back, this popped up. So somebody asks, Emily asks, with reinforcing behaviors, how do you reinforce a relaxed transition if the horse has it ingrained to throw their head during the stride of a transition and then softening again? Okay, I'm going to come back to that. Don't worry, Emily. So we're talking about generalized anxiety. We're doing our in-hand work. Let's say we're doing it at a show. Our horse has been super great at home. We unload at a showgrounds, and what unloads is like an absolute lunatic. It's just, maybe they're not doing anything super bad, but you can just tell, like the horse is just radiating nerves. And you're like, okay, I'm gonna do my groundwork. I'm gonna do my homework. And you lead the horse forward, and their head is straight up in the air, and they're super rigid, but they go off a light aid. And then you stop, and they stop. And you're like, okay, that's right, isn't it? Maybe not. It would be worth seeing if you can play with your head control. Can you get the neck lower? Can you yield the horse's hindquarters in a soft and measured way? Obviously, it's no good if the horse puts their head down and then shoots off sideways. So anyhow, it's an incredibly long-winded way to say that when dealing with anxiety, I just do everything I can to help the horse find patterns of movement with relaxation deeply ingrained. So when I'm at home and I have mostly control over the environment, what I'm going to do is I'm going to work on those walk-trot transitions until I'm pretty sure I can get them most of the time with relaxation, if not all the time. Again, we want to think about as if the horse is like a cuneiform tablet, right? The more times you wire that I put my leg on and you relax and trot, the more likely it is that the horse is going to choose that because it's been so deeply, deeply reinforced. And that requires a lot more repetitions than you think it does. A lot of repetitions. So Emily said, just to go back to that, with reinforcing behaviors, how do you reinforce a relaxed transition if the horse has it ingrained to throw their head during the stride of a transition and then softening again? Emily, would you clarify, does the horse then soften in the next step? So it's just like one head toss? Okay, so she says yes. So that one can be kind of tricky. I would say that you have a couple of choices. You can make it very difficult to throw their head a little bit. Let's say do your transitions on a very small circle, and then sort of trick the horse into a place where it's very difficult to throw your head in that one transition. They're on a very small circle, they pick up the trot, but they're like turning, and if they throw their head, they're going to throw themselves off balance. You can ride a little bit in a way that I'm imagining most horses, I'd say like 95% of horses out there, when they go to throw their head, they actually drop the contact and then throw their head up a little bit. So you can get very stable in your position where if they drop the contact, there's no feel, but that you're super solid so that they kind of run into your hand as they throw the head, so that there's actually an element of punishment in that. Now, I would not recommend at all that you punish the horse afterwards, because there's no way your timing is going to be sufficient for that, especially if the horse has come to the conclusion, for better or for worse. I always do this transition with one little head flip. So I think your best bet probably would be to combine transitions and a little bit of lateral work, and then have a way to have there be like a mother lode reward for the first time you trick the horse well. Like, I don't know whether that means like get off, strip the tack. I don't know whether you can carry a cookie and be like, look at this, my friend, wasn't that the best decision you ever made? But if you can really mark that moment as the best thing the horse has ever done, it makes it a little more likely that the next time you go to school it and try to make it very difficult to offer their ingrained pattern of behavior, that they might more readily offer that thing that got them that super awesome reward last time. Does that answer your question, Emily? Okay, super. Okay, any other questions about emotional states, anxiety at large, basic in hand work as a way of testing and minimizing anxiety? I have a question here about a horse that kicks out when anxious and upset. Can you describe the situation to me a little bit more? Okay, so she says, not malicious, not aimed at the handlers, but will kick out with hind feet when he gets overwhelmed. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm imagining sort of like the horse that young event horse whose hind boots get wet for the first time and they're like trying to kick the boots off or whatever. It's not at anything in particular. It's just an upset shaking off of anxiety. So that's okay, super. So she says that's exactly what that looks like. That can be sort of a tricky thing, because if there's not any particular initiation of this, if there's no reason in particular that it starts, other than the horse's emotional state is rising, they're getting too close to threshold, it can be tricky to prevent that from happening. Obviously, all the things we've been talking about, being sure that we have a light response to our very basic command aids, that we're just being really aware of, that we aren't allowing the general anxiety of the horse to escalate our low level of aids. And then, so this one is the McLean in the book. What it would say would be that you have an insufficient go and an insufficient stop response. So that would be kind of exactly the same thing we've been talking about. You just go back and you do your 3 sets of 3. You kind of see where you are on the shaping scale. You do the light aid forward, the light aid backward for forward and stop. You test your head control, you test your yield. Now, that might not be sufficient by any stretch of the imagination. If this horse were to show up at my barn, I would get yield super solid. Like, I want to be able to cross both hind legs either way anytime. And when he starts getting upset, I'm going to just yield him until he quits. I actually probably have an image of a version of this here. Let's see if I can find it. I can kind of talk through it as I show you. And so I would there I'm riding. That's cool. So here, like I wanted to touch this horse with the flag, and you can very clearly see that he said, no, thank you. And then I do, so I'm being very, I'm following through. I'm asking him, I'm keeping him with me. I'm keeping, and then as he settled, I released I think we're missing a picture here where he actually stood and let me touch him with it. But, yeah, he's very angry with the flag. So the moment of release in that, if you say that they're kicking out and then you put them into a yield and their hind legs are crossing, the moment of release is super critical. The moment the horse organizes a little bit, and you know what I mean, like they can kind of shuffle sideways and then they organize to take those good steps. The moment they start to organize is the moment that you quit asking. And if they go right back to being anxious, you just put them in yield again. You could also pick rein back. That's a little trickier. I find that I have less control over my size of my training area if I were to do rein back for kicking like that, and quite possibly more likely to result in rearing instead of kicking. So I think I'd prefer yield in that situation. So I want them to cross their hind legs, cross their hind legs, cross their hind legs. And the moment it gets organized, you release. So you want to make it to the horse feel really good to just stand with all their feet on the ground, like super good. And that is sort of the finishing state of any yield, all 4 feet on the ground. And so yeah, so that's how I would handle that. It's a long way to explain that. What else? Did Emily say that she had another question? Okay. She says, never mind. Okay, does that need any further clarification? I, of course, don't want to move on if that makes no sense at all. Does that make sense? Okay, all right. She says that's great. All right, Megan, what do we have? What else do we have?
We have a couple more. Well, we've got a lot, but I want to start with, we should probably get into spooking because that was the most common behavior. And so there's spooking at nothing, there's spooking with anxiety, and then there's like a playful kind of jump in the air, spooky type behavior. Okay. And so I'm sure each of those may be a little bit different, but spooking in general, my horse spooks, so I would love to hear your take on that.
Sure. So there are pretty much 6 ways that we can address spooking. And I'm going to just refer to spooking at large. There are different versions of spooking. Absolutely. There's the shy, where they throw the shoulders. There's the shy combined with a bolt. That's my favorite. There's the spook where they just flinch inside themselves. And then there's the spook where maybe there's no outward sign of tension, but you're very clearly trigger stacking. And that's where a horse might stay under your stimulus control, but barely. But really we of the different, so I'm just kind of lumping it all together to move through here and see what questions we can generate. We can we have systematic desensitization, which is like the very natural horsemanship-y desensitization, right? Like a little bit of a scary thing, and then you stop being scary when the horse starts to relax. Then a little more of the scary thing, like, let's say I'm shaking my flag or whatever. And then you stop when the horse relaxes until you can pretty much get the horse, you can do whatever you want with said scary thing, plastic trash bag or your flag or whatever. And so that's particularly helpful if your horse is spooky about things, like I had a horse a bunch of years ago that really thought cones were pretty much the end. Like that was it. If you get close to a cone, like the ground was going to open up and like devour this poor creature. So we did a lot of systematic desensitization with cones until the horse could walk calmly, between cones. That took a while. But you do it bit by bit. The other benefit of the systematic desensitization, especially with the random spookers, is you're wiring the pathway from feeling nervous to relaxing. You're practicing that track. You're practicing that emotional movement. It's maybe not, it is often accompanied by physical movement, but that sort of, the horse can feel that zinger of fear, and they've practiced moving from a little bit of nervousness through to not to relaxation, and then to the scary thing going away because they've relaxed. And the more you can practice that, the more likely it is that something out in the wild happens. A deer jumps up out of the bushes, and the horse goes, I know how to handle this. That's very anthropomorphic how I just described that, but that they experience that fear, and because how deep the reinforcement history is for experiencing something nerve-wracking and going to relaxation. So I think that's why you see so much emphasis on systematic desensitization. You can counter condition. You can change the stimulus from something fearful into something positive. This is helpful for clickers, right? Clippers. You hear the clippers and you get a snack, and then the clippers touch you and you get a snack. It goes from being mildly aversive, like it's sort of tickly and irritating, and that buzzing whine is very obnoxious, to kind of exciting. Oh my gosh, the clippers came out, I get snacks, in the most simplistic way. Counter conditioning can be helpful for scary corners. Definitely helpful for scary corners. Scary corners are great because I get snacks, is the most strong way to do that. I would, if you're going to use cookies for your counter conditioning, or grain, or what have you, pellets, anything, I would definitely pair that with a bridge cue and be reinforcing for relaxation signals. So you click for, maybe a softening around the eye, or a lowering of the head, or a cocking of the hip, so that you are more clearly identifying to the horse that what you're rewarding isn't just existing in this corner, but also that is relaxing in that corner. Overshadowing. Horses can't pay attention to two things at once. And we talked a lot about overshadowing when we were talking about going back to the basics of your in-hand work. Although I did not use that word. So can you go forward off a super light aid? Can you stop off a super light aid? Can you go back? So the most common way to overshadow something is to take one step forward, take one step back, take one step forward, take one step back for, let's say, injections or clippers again. Very, very common. Or if you're in an area where a horse maybe has a hot spot, like this wall over here, just for some reason is like definitely filled with demons. And I'm pretty sure there's a lion living in between the wall and the gate over there. You could kind of do that. I call it the cha-cha. You could do that in hand. You can do it under saddle. You take one step forward, one step back, one step forward, one step back until it's super light, off super light aids. And it's just not entirely, and if you've done your homework the way we've talked about it, and that you've really practiced doing those steps forward and those steps back with the relaxation pattern, it won't take you too much until you have the horse standing near the wall that almost certainly has a tiger behind it, stepping forward and back in a relaxed pattern, because that's what they've had the reinforcement history for, and the depth of history for. We can use the fourth method of spook busting. We can approach condition. You see this a lot. How would I describe this? So something is sort of scary and you move the horse towards it, and then that thing goes away. So you see this kind of naturally with those giant inflatable balls that sometimes horses play with. They're very nervous about it, and then they snort on it and it rolls away, and they're like, what's that? It's something kind of ingrained in their nature. I do it a bunch with flags. I'll put the flag on the ground and they approach it, and then the flag goes away. You do it with plastic bags too. Almost as if then the horse, it appears as if the horse feels as if it's chasing the frightening thing. I've done it with horses who are afraid of trucks and cars. I've roped a friend into driving a car, and the horse approaches the car and the car runs away. And that can be quite effective. I'm not entirely sure why. I don't know what benefit that has in terms of their natural ethology, but it is effective. Austin just says she chases deer with her young horse and he doesn't spook at them anymore. Yeah, it is, if you can do that, it's very effective. You can, so the fifth way of handling spooky things, you can stimulus blend. So you blend a novel stimulus into a stimulus that they're used to. So again, this is a little bit like, we'll go back to clippers, just because so many horses hate them. So for that one, you would get the horse super used to the hose, right? And then you'd be hosing them, and then you would add the clipper sound for a moment, and then you would turn it all off if they showed signs of relaxation. And then eventually you fade the hose, and then you just have the clipper left, and the horse we don't see that one a lot in practice, but it is a valid spook busting method. And then the sixth and most common method of handling spooking, I think, probably is response prevention, where you basically prevent the horse from responding. Of course, this is super infuriating when your trainer says, don't let him do that. And you're like, great, I'd love to not let him do that. But that's what you're hearing, is you're hearing someone who has perhaps stronger, better riding patterns, who is used to being able to influence the horse in the way that they just can't do that. And you might not find that incredibly helpful. So we won't go into that too much, because if you could prevent it, you would. So I would definitely say that our strongest and most useful spook busting methods, to use a vernacular from an entirely different world, are your systematic desensitization and your counter conditioning. One fascinating thing that comes out of the research is how long it takes to see a demonstrable blood level, the adrenaline drop in the blood level of horses after they've seen something quite spooky. It's about 13 seconds. So if you stop the horse, so the other thing to think about that's super important is that the horse is wired for the flight response. They're literally wired to run. They have the biggest amygdala of any domestic animal. And that's the section of their brain that's in charge of fear and flight. They are really good at being afraid of things. They're super good at it. The prey animals. And so when you are dealing with a spooky horse, the biggest thing is not to let them get far fast, if at all possible. The farther they go, the faster they go, the deeper the fear is written, the easier it is for them to grab as a reaction the next time. I mean, that gets written super deep, super fast. One really good spook and really long bolt can overwrite so many positive training sessions. I'm sure I have a study on it somewhere where there's some numbers on that. I can't recall off the top of my head. But so one of the things, so this horse actually that's on screen right now is pretty good at the shy, that where he throws the shoulder and runs away from things. And so what we've been doing to tremendous success is turning him to face whatever is scary in a way that he has to yield his hind legs, a little turn on the forehand E, and then stopping. Right? If we can get him to stop, that's super, because we want to get control over that run behavior as quickly as possible. And we give him 13 or so seconds to think, is what we call it, but who knows what's actually going on in his head. And then we proceed again. So this is doing a couple of different things. We're hopefully wiring in a systematic desensitization way. We're wiring the pathway from fear to relaxation so that path is really easy to follow. It's just neurally deeply wired. And then we are a little bit, it's response prevention. I mean, not 100%, he's still spooking, but it is definitely preventing him from escalating to a point where that turn and run, that fast and far, that gets so deeply written, hopefully we're shortening that, we're smallening the response a little bit. So that's our 6 basic ways of handling spooking. What questions do you guys have for me?
I don't know if we have any questions.
I was just going to say, none at all. I've explained everything perfectly. That would be crazy.
Yeah.
So I know that there were some other things, but I also feel like I've had you guys here for an hour and a half. So definitely, I don't know if we want to do any more now. I know Megan can send my email out. And I would be happy to answer any further questions anyone has, or if we want to go into, if anybody wants to reach out to me on their own, and I can go into sort of individual private challenges. if there are any questions that wouldn't take too long, I don't know, it's up to you guys. We can totally wrap it up. I've had you guys for a long time. Okay, I do see a question. My horse can go from relaxed at threshold very quickly. Yeah, that's a super big challenge because I'm imagining this is probably a young, fairly inexperienced horse. The ability to help a horse increase their emotional capacity to handle chaos, that's none of those words are within the equitation science framework, for which I apologize. But so then she adds from spooking it some external stimuli. Yeah, so like I covered the systematic desensitization, just practicing finding things a little scary and then relaxing as a like getting a reward. And the reward in that case, you can very easily, if the horse finds a bunch of things scary, it's almost easier to practice this. You can have a plastic bag, and you can start really just by holding the plastic bag in your fist and crinkling it. That's a very small, but sometimes horses can react in a really big way. Practicing feeling a little nervous and then displaying more relaxation signals. The more deeply you can practice and wire that, the more creative you can get with that, the better off you're going to be, and the more you're going to increase your horse's emotional capacity to handle chaos, as I said. But anyways, if there's nothing else on what I've covered, please feel free to reach out to me separately with any further questions. We have a question here. I have a question.
We had another one. Olivia submitted ears not being touched, and then someone else did as well. So that would be probably a good one to end on, unless anyone else had submitted one that they're dying to share.
Dying to hear. Okay, all right. So I'll talk about ears. Okay, head shy, ear shy, etc. Ears are tough because it is so easy for the very first interaction a horse ever has to their ears being touched to be kind of negative. Ears are super sensitive. They have a ton of blood flow. They're incredibly tickly. It's just really easy to have negative experiences with ears straight away, like early in a horse's life. So that's written very early for them. Which of course the thing that's written first is written deepest. So yes, he came to me like this, Olivia says. Yeah, I mean, that's, a lot of them do. So if it's an intermittent behavior, so I see you say, we'll do clicker training until he's fine. And then one random day he decides they can't be touched again. My guess is that you need to keep doing the clicker training even when he's good for a lot longer than you think, in order to deepen that reinforcement history enough so that your maintenance of it can just be good timing. That he's okay with it, and you touch the ears, and you have to be very careful not to stop touching his ears when he's upset about things. Now, Olivia, I think I know this horse. That of course is not real. Like, you can't, when he's very upset, you can't do that. I mean, nobody's tall enough or strong enough to just like hold on to this like basilisk-y monster and just like casually touch his ears until all 4 feet hit the ground and he relaxes. That's not possible. So I think the clicker training is absolutely the way to go. But it can be really easy to start to reinforce in a very minute and small way, that you're putting the fly mask on, and the horse just sort of tilts their head a little bit the one time as you're putting it on, and you go away without readdressing it. Now you don't want to go in, super strong, but that can't be the last one in a session of ear touching, so to speak. But really, I do think that if you're doing clicker training and it's working, you probably have to keep doing more clicker training than you realize in order to overwrite. I mean, at this point, the horse is 10. Anyways, he's old, adult. He's an adult horse. In the horse's world, he has like 15,000 bad ear experiences, and maybe like, I don't know, I'm just throwing totally random numbers out, 45 to 150 clicker training sessions with his ears. I mean, it's just going to be so easy for the positive veneer of the clicker training to wear off and for him to resort to that very deeply written ear phobia. But the McLean, the text right out of the book says that if the horse's head or ear shy, you've insufficiently habituated them to ear touching, and that it's almost certainly an incorrect application of negative reinforcement. So like I was saying, like just accidentally bad timing when they're pulling away from you and you released because you were finished, you'd already got the mask on or whatever, or you're petting them and you maybe run your hand over their forehead and over their ear and back, and they were pulling away from you, but you were kind of already moving backwards, that kind of thing. It's very easy to accidentally reinforce very small negative responses to ear touching that then escalate. They escalate very quickly. How would you go about teaching a horse to bridle? Wow, that one is such an excellent question, Teresa. I'm wondering, Megan, what do you think? Maybe we should collect some more of these and do maybe do one on a whole bunch of like very individual details.
Yeah, I like that idea, that we could, gather some more specific kind of stories and do another one of these.
I think I could definitely get some videos about how I'm doing bridling these days from Ray's standpoint. We could go over trailering. I know that's a problem for a lot of people, maybe not for any of you, but we could do it anyhow.
Yeah, well, you have some interesting trailer problems.
I do have an interesting trailering problem. I was prepared to talk about it.
Yeah.
Oh, no, not that one. No, that's not the one I want. I'll show you. I don't know if you can see. I had to put my trailer in my round pen in order to get the horse in it. But anyhow, thank you guys so much for hanging in for this very long talk. So yeah, I think we'll definitely do another one, and we can do that next one very much just as like an ask the trainer, and just come up with all your worst problems, throw them at me. We'll see what we can come up with.
Yeah, I think that would be super fun.
All right.
Some of that. Yeah, well, thank you guys all for coming for our second one of these. Kate will obviously be back. We've got a couple more lined up for next week. I don't yet have dates and times, but I will send out that information as soon as I know. And then I'll chat with Kate and we'll see what her schedule is like and when we can get her back. But in the meantime, I'm compiling everything in a Google Doc between her and I. And so if you have any problems with your horses or something, that you'd like to share with us, go ahead and throw that in there. I put Kate's email in I think I have her email in the to section of this last email blast. And so if you have any specific questions for her, she's a very nice person and would love to hear from you individually. And yeah, this was great. So thank you so much, Kate, and thank you so much for being available at the last minute.
No problem. Good night, everybody.
We did this 2 days ago. So.
Yeah,
Yeah. Okay, well, I will send you guys this recording in the next 48 hours. This is my weekend project, so great. And we'll see you again next time.
All right, fantastic. Good night.
Good night.